In this lecture, we'll talk about Texas during the Great Depression and the New Deal. So the time period about 1929 to the beginning of America's involvement in the World War, in World War II, in 1941. So I'm going to bring in a lot of national history as it relates to Texas history and how Texas was affected by the Great Depression more specifically. So that's what I'll dive into. So we're going to pick up pretty much where we left off last time, where we were talking about what Texas was like in the 1920s, right? You might remember this was a time period of the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age in Texas at the time. And of course, one of the biggest things that happens to Texas at the turn of the century was Spindletop, right? And so by 1929, Texas led the world in production of crude oil. Cars were becoming a thing. The Model T rolled off the assembly line in 1908. By 1914, Henry Ford had made an affordable car for everyone. So one out of every four residents in Texas had a car by 1929. The cities of Dallas, San Antonio, Houston were growing. Galveston was recovering from the flood. But one of the big problems that we're going to see from the very beginning of this era is the fact that overproduction becomes a really big issue. Overproduction in the farms and overproduction for oil. Nationally, Texans vote their very first Republican candidate in history into office, and that was overwhelmingly Herbert Hoover, who was elected in 1928. Now, he's going to go down as the president who basically did nothing during the Great Depression and thought it would fix on its own. So he's going to lose popularity very quickly. But it is significant to note that this is the first Republican candidate that Texans elected. Also at this time period, also important to note, is a new governor that is elected, a man named Ross Sterling, who is an humble oil executive. And we'll talk about him a little bit in this lecture as well. Okay, so I'll move myself over here a little bit. One thing that I definitely want to clarify is the cause of the Great Depression. A lot of Americans want to point just to one big event and say, that's it, it was a stock market crash. And that is actually ahistorical. What really causes the Great Depression are the bank runs. And you can say that was partially due to the stock market crash, but it actually wasn't the biggest dip in the U.S. stock market. That doesn't happen, I think, 1932 or 1933. I've got a video that's just below here you should watch, and that one is on busting some of the myths about the Great Depression, and it talks about those bank runs. But I do want to at least describe what the stock market crash was. Essentially, many investors were buying on stock on margin, which is essentially they were buying stock that they didn't have money for. They were borrowing money. And they were getting some of their money from banks with this. So they would pay $1 up front for $10 worth of stock and pay, down the road what they owed off of the profits that they made. The problem, of course, was a lot of stock speculation occurred, and it really happens with a Thursday before, which they call Black Thursday, and that's when people start saying, oh, the stock market might crash, so nervous investors pull their money out, and lo and behold, by next Tuesday, the stock market at that point, it hit its lowest dip ever in history. And again, I mentioned just a moment ago, there actually was a bigger dip in 1933. Many lost their fortunes overnight, but it is important to note that most Texans did not invest in the stock market. So they weren't really initially hit by this big stock market crash. Like I mentioned, the really big thing that happens that causes the depression is the bank runs, okay? Now, I want you to imagine that you have your money in a bank. And let's say it's Frost Banks, and that's a local bank. And I'm not throwing any shade at Frost Bank at all. But it's a local bank, and let's say that you heard a rumor that they were running out of money. What would you do, right? Your theory is, well, I better go there and get my money out, because you may or may not realize this, banks don't just hold on to your money. They use that to make investments themselves. And unfortunately, some of the banks had made investments in the stock market. So they really did. Some of them were a little cash poor. But what really collapses the banking system is the people, and you can see some of the images here of bank runs, would literally line up to pull their money out, and it would collapse a bank. Okay. And so this is what ultimately causes the depression, because if banks don't exist, people can't get loans in order to run their business. And if people can't get loans to run their business, they can't have a business. So businesses collapse, which means that unemployment happens. And this is really what causes the Great Depression to really occur. And so what was Texas like during the Great Depression? Well, Texas in the Great Depression, just so you know, and I'm going to move myself out of the way here again so you can see this a little better, but they fared a little bit better than most places in the United States, partially because they had many of them self-sustaining farms, so they could feed themselves. They didn't have to rely on as much government assistance as mainly many other places across the nation. But about 5,000 banks do fail, and that does affect Texas, okay? In 1933, 113 banks had closed, so there were fewer banks. Businesses had failed. 350,000 Texans were unemployed. Nationwide, it's about a third of the workforce that is decreased. Most of the workforce, though, that comes from that third were actually people of color, African Americans specifically. They made up in their group, employment group, about half of them were unemployed. And so the other thing that really causes Texas to dip into this horrible depression as well is the fact that it didn't diversify the crops, right? The two really big things that were in Texas at the time were oil and cotton. Cotton prices drop. You can see this, the price of cotton drops significantly between 1928 and 1931. And the other thing is the massive amount of oil production and overproduction that occurs, and that causes the oil prices to drop. So both of those really sink Texas into more of a depression. One other group that is really hard hit by the Great Depression were those of Mexican ancestry. And so I want to clarify that I'm saying Mexican ancestry because most of, or many of the Mexican Americans who were victims of this repatriation, which is the removal from one country and placed into their country of origin, most of them were American born. So most of these were American citizens by the 14th Amendment, okay? People estimate, historians estimate anywhere in the low end from 400,000 to the high end about 500,000 of Mexican Americans that are repatriated, about half of them coming from Texas. The peak repatriation year was in 1931. A lot of this had to do with the cotton crops that had dropped significantly, and they wanted to leave jobs open to, the white yeoman farmers. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers kind of exacerbate this problem, because there were poor farmers that were running these farms. A lot of Mexican Americans that worked in labor intensive industries in the bigger cities lose their jobs and are forced out. Okay. Urban repatriation was really fueled by local Mexican American campaigns as well as statewide immigration service deportation campaigns. So there's deportation raids that are carried out both in rural and in urban areas. And actually in Malakoff, Texas, the headquarters of the Society of Mexican Laborers were bombed. So this was a height of anti-Mexican sentiment. Now it's going to completely change gears 20 years later with the Bracero program, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, but it's significant to talk about what happened to Mexican Americans at this time. Women during the Great Depression, women are not hired over white men and men in general, and that is because a lot of laborers or a lot of employers see that, well, if there can only be one one wage earner, it needs to be a man. And actually in San Antonio, there was a school board that essentially said, if you have a husband that makes more than $2,000 a year, then you're fired, right? They wouldn't even allow female teachers. And some people wouldn't even hire single teachers. So, significant that women lose quite a bit of autonomy. That a lot of them had beginning to gain and been able to be present with a new woman and flapper in the workforce and more accepted, and it really takes a step back during the Great Depression. One of the biggest things that does happen and does affect Texas significantly, and you can see that from this map over here, is the Dust Bowl. So I've got a video clip on the Dust Bowl. It's really good. It's from History Channel, The Story of Us. It's just a clip from it. But essentially, this cultivation of crops, not just in Texas, but throughout the Great Plains, in combination with a drought that hit the area in the early 1930s causes what's known as the Dust Bowl. People would get something called dust pneumonia, in which they would inhale this dust into their lungs. You can see, I thought that was kind of interesting to put a chart, kind of dust storms in Texas, major ones anyway, and you can see it actually peaks all the way up to 1937. Many people flee Texas because there's just nothing left here, and they move to California. And there's a lot of people, most of the people actually leave from Oklahoma and go to California. And so the people, the Dust Bowl refugees, are nicknamed the Okies because of that. They're that, even though most of them do come from Oklahoma, but many came from Texas and Kansas and other places like that. Now, I mentioned before the issue with the oil overproduction, okay? This issue is totally exacerbated by the fact that in Kilgore, Texas, another oil discovery, right? Even bigger than Spindletop is discovered. Now, in 1889, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had actually stated a law that whoever drilled here owned it. This causes a flurry of people to flock over to Kilgore, Texas. And instead of having one company, you had all these people nicknamed wildcatters that were essentially just trying to dig and get as much oil as they could. The Railroad Commission actually tries to come in and limit the amount of oil that is being dug up, but it's ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. SCOTUS, I always abbreviate it that way, that stands for Supreme Court of the United States. Governor Sterling, remember he was an oil man from East Texas, he calls martial law and brings the National Guard, the Texas Rangers, to basically help limit this lawlessness that was occurring at this time. FDR became president. I'll talk about him in just a little bit. But essentially, he says maybe the federal government should intervene. Texas doesn't want this. It has a long history of not wanting that. And in 1935, the Hot Oil Act is passed, which caused most of the independent people, wildcatters, to sell to big oil. And by 1935, or by the end of 1940, 80% of oil in East Texas was owned by big oil. So it does that. They limit it, but to the detriment of small-time people. I can't stress this enough, the importance of the fact that you understand that overproduction was a huge issue in Texas. Governor Sterling actually meets with several other governors, and they agree to reduce cotton production. SCOTUS again rules this unconstitutional. Sterling decides, or actually he runs again against the Fergusons. Ma Ferguson, remember Pa Ferguson cannot run because he was impeached and removed from office. So his wife Ma Ferguson wins again, and there's a lot of question about that election, saying that there was quite a bit of election fraud. Either way, Ma Ferguson does become the governor for another term. I do want to also mention, though, that most of the state programs that were enacted are really overshadowed by the federal programs. And so I'm going to spend the next couple slides talking about the New Deal FDR programs that come in to curb the Depression itself. So in 1933, campaigning on a New Deal, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat from New York, who was the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, who's also his wife's first uncle. That means that they were fifth cousins. I know that kind of eludes some people, but they were fifth cousins, are really not that related. But either way, FDR selects as his running mate somebody from Texas, a guy named John Nance Garner of Uvalde. And a lot of people say that Uvalde was maybe one of the most powerful vice presidents of the time period. He did advise FDR quite a bit. Now, their paths are going to split. He'll run again the next term, but the third term he won't run again with him over a court packing plan, which I'll describe here in just a second. But he was Garner was a former Speaker of the House. He had a good relationship with a lot of politicians in Congress. But, FDR campaigns on two things. Number one, he was going to stop the basically ineffectiveness of the Hoover government that did nothing to help the great people of the Great Depression. That was his biggest thing. Another was getting rid of prohibition, which he does do. Okay. But FDR by far is the president that is able to pass the most number of legislation ever in history in first 100 days. So his first 100 days is specifically going to focus on the banking crisis. He was very famous for something known as his fireside chats, where he would talk humbly to people who had radios all throughout their homes every Sunday evening and talk to them. He called them his fireside chats and let them know what he thought the American public needed to do. And a lot of historians point to this as a way that really FDR separated himself from previous presidents, and other future presidents will take note of, to where he kind of makes himself very homely, very humbles himself to the average person. But one of the biggest things he does is something known as the bank holiday. So what he wanted to do was shut down all of the banks, and he was going to send federal regulators to go in and look at those banks and say, are they healthy? And only the banks that were healthy were reopened. Okay, but he tasked the American public with one really big thing, and that was, once I open these up, the banks that are healthy will be reopened. You have to put your money in there. You got to pull it from underneath your mattress and put it back into the bank, because that is the only way that the country will become revitalized. And the people do it, okay? And he actually does do a very good job recovering the bank. So there is a slew of different agencies, hundreds of agencies that FDR created, many of them still around today, like the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which guarantees your deposits in bank. Initially, I think it was like $5,000, or maybe a little bit less than that, but today it's $250,000 the FDIC insures. So there were different ways he does this: through immediate relief, giving checks and putting money in the hand of the people that need it; recovery, taking those organizations that needed like some life support and recovering them; and then reforming many that were completely broken. Like, there was no watch over bank regulation, but there was always also no watch over the stock market. So the Securities and Exchange Commission were created. The link that's here is a list of just a small portion of his programs and what they did. Okay. One of the things you might not realize is that one of the programs that was created was actually the Works Progress Administration, which hired millions, 10 million people around the United States. But one of the things it does is try to create a tourist industry where people would go visit. And one of those things, one of the places that is actually created by the Works Progress Administration is the Riverwalk. Bet you didn't know that, right? So the Riverwalk was created in 1938. You can actually look and find this plaque if you go down to the Riverwalk that says it's part of the Works Progress Administration. So FDR does a lot of things. He's an incredibly popular president. He's actually going to run and win 4 times. The constitutional amendment that limits presidential terms comes after FDR, and the only reason FDR resigns is because he dies. Okay, and that is truly what happened. But one thing to also note is that people that were in the New Deal, or that were part of it, a lot of the marginalized groups were left out. Not completely left out, but definitely did not receive the same benefits as their white counterparts. So African Americans, like I mentioned, were the hardest hit, 50% unemployment. African Americans in Houston received 25% less assistance than whites. Some people wouldn't hire African Americans because they hired whites first. And a lot of the firing came in with last hired, first fired programs, and that, of course, meant that people of color were the first ones to go. The National Youth Administration, which actually was headed by a young congressman named Lyndon Baines Johnson, which we'll talk about later on, was able to hire more African Americans than any of the other agencies. And then also there were some Mexican Americans that were able to prevail during this, particularly in the Works Progress Administration beautification part. Mexican muralist, very famous, Diego Rivera, he gets a lot of his commissioning by the Works Progress Administration. Now in Texas during this time period, another governor comes to power, and he was a man known as Pappy. And that came from his radio show. He was actually a radio personality from Fort Worth, and also was a flower salesman. And so the Hillbilly Doughboys was his band and everything like that. But essentially, he was kind of a larger than life personality. He was very similar to the tactics of like the Fergusons, which they were like this down homey kind of person. He commanded like a 10 Commandments kind of platform, almost like a revivalist sort of way. He's so popular at the time that he wins without a runoff, which was really unheard of during that time period in Texas history. But he's going to come to play a little bit later. He'll eventually give up his seat at governorship to go for the Senate, and he wins the Senate. And we'll talk about him a little bit later on. But one thing that I do want to point out as I kind of close out this talk is a little graph that shows the millions of people that were unemployed in the United States. So here's the stock market crash to give it some context. And of course, the bank runs, which hit a peak here. This is where the bank runs really hit their peak. FDR is inaugurated. So obviously his New Deal program, you can't argue that it didn't help because the federal government did employ millions of people. And so his plan helps. Unfortunately, there was a small recession. He enters his second New Deal. And then World War II begins. The United States begins to produce for the Allied powers, which helps America's economy. But ultimately, when the United States enters the war and we enter full throttle into this arsenal for democracy, that's when the United States really becomes, or comes out of the Great Depression. All right, so that will be what our next lecture is about. It's about World War II and the war years, a little bit of overlap, but I definitely wanted to separate these two ideas out.